Welcome to Change Happened, Then What? Where each week in Season 1 of the Friendship Chronicles, I share real-life stories from incredible people I've met over the past 20-plus years. Stories of change, challenge, and what comes next. These are the moments that shape them, the pivots that led to purpose, and the raw emotions in between. My hope is that these conversations inspire you, offer hope, and in the end, leave you with a smile. So, wherever you are, take a deep breath and let's dive in, because change happens, and that's where the story really begins. I'm your host, Heather Holt, and I'm so happy to have you here today. Today, I'm introducing you to Melinda, a woman I have always admired in business and in life. For years, I've circled around her world, thinking to myself, wow, I would love to be as amazing as she is someday. We've never quite become the kind of friends you've heard about in this season, but Melinda has always been connected to many of my closest friends. And she has been an influencer in our community for so long. So when people I love kept saying, you need to tell her story, and I already admired her from afar, I thought, how could I not reach out to the great Melinda Moulton and just hope she would say yes? And yes, she said. Melinda is one of those women you can't help but be drawn to. Compassionate, loving, an all-around amazing human. And as you're about to hear, that light has been with her since she was a little girl. At just 8 years old, Melinda had her very first change happened moment when she decided she was going to be a cliff jumper. That fearless, adventurous spark has carried her through her entire life. It feels so fitting to close out Season 1 with her story, because Melinda brings wisdom, experience, and countless change happen moments to the table. So let's begin right at the start with Melinda sharing her memories of growing up, her family, the lessons, and the roots of who she is today.
Life was rolling along just fine and dandy up until I was about 8 years old, when my mother put me in an Imperial convertible car with my brother and drove us to Mexico, where we spent 2 months traveling around Mexico with my mother. It was towards the end of the trip where my father flew into Acapulco. We were in a restaurant high up in the clouds watching the cliff divers in Acapulco, and my parents announced that they were getting a divorce, and I was 8 years old. And it was at that moment that I decided I was going to become a cliff diver. And I thought I would just harness my sorrow and my sadness and turn it into something positive. But it's completely transformed my life.
Okay, so here we are, at 8 years old, learning that our parents are going to get a divorce. And Melinda transforms that moment into a lifelong desire for cliff jumping as she watches divers outside the restaurant window. Well, I guess it's a good thing they took her to Mexico for this announcement and not Niagara Falls. Otherwise, she might have decided to climb into a barrel and take her chances of going over. It sounds like she was just that adventurous.
I cannot remember how I got home. I cannot remember anything after that moment at that restaurant. But eventually I did get home, and my father was gone. He had found another woman he had fallen in love with, and they were going to make a life together. My mother and my 3 siblings and I tried to survive, live in this rambling home in Allentown. So we lived there about 4 years. My mother was, unbeknownst to all of us, developing a drinking problem. She would be up all night and asleep all day. I didn't see much of my father. He would come and pick us up and take us fishing or do things with us on the weekends, but we didn't see much of him. And I was very, very close to my dad. My mother had a couple of lovely men in her life, and one in particular that she was very serious with. It was a relationship that I think she thought was going to be her second marriage. And what happened was she got pregnant, again, unbeknownst to anybody. For the 9 months that she was pregnant, she wore a girdle. Nobody knew she was pregnant. Her mother didn't know she was pregnant. Her sister didn't know she was pregnant. No one knew she was pregnant. And on an August day, my mother came down the stairs, and my mother announced that she was going to go to a hospital, that she needed an operation. And off she went. And my grandmother, her mother, moved in with us.
I'm going to pause here for a moment for you younger listeners. When Melinda and I sat down to record, she proudly reminded me that she had just turned 75. So let's do the math. She was born in 1950. That means in 1958, she was just 8 years old, already declaring she was going to be a cliff jumper. And only a few short years later, unknown to her or her entire family, her mother was carrying a child. Now, I want you to really picture this time period. The late 50s and early 60s were not kind to women. Divorce carried enormous stigma, and a woman left by her husband was often shamed, whispered about, and judged harshly by her community. To make matters worse, becoming pregnant outside of a marriage was often seen as scandalous. Many women hid their pregnancies under girdles or loose clothing out of fear that society would judge them. This was not all that long ago, and it's important to pause and remember just how hard the world could be for women, simply just for being a woman.
It was 4 days before Christmas that my mother died, and nobody really knew what had happened. We found out later, many years later, that it was this weird little mansion on top of a hill, and I guess it's where women went who didn't want people to know what was going on in their lives reproductively. And the man who she was in love with never, abandoned her when she announced she was pregnant. He abandoned her. So she was all alone. She had one friend, I think, who really stood close to her. What we found out years and years later when this woman called me and said, "I'm your sister." She was 18 years old, and her adoptive mother gave her my mother's obituary. My mother went off to this place to have the baby. And after the baby was born, my mother found a wonderful family for this little girl to go to, because my mother already had 4 children. So she had this child, and who called me. She was 18 years old, and she came up, and she looked just like my mom. She's the only one of the kids who looks like my mom. They delivered the baby. The baby was given up for adoption to this great family, and then the doctors convinced her to have a hysterectomy. She had a hysterectomy, and the doctors were not qualified, and somehow they created some damage in her colon, and she developed peritonitis. So by the time my father and his new wife and my mother's sister and mother got her out of that place that she was in and got her to a legitimate hospital, she died a week later. And she was 40 years old. I was 12. She had a 6-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 16-year-old child. And we were, motherless. That was a big moment in my life.
Losing your mom at just 12 years old and just before Christmas? Yeah, that is a life-changing moment. Especially when you don't even really know why she went away in the first place. And yes, today, peritonitis is treatable and curable when caught early. But in the early 60s, when Melinda's mom was already dealt a raw hand while staying in the mansion on the hill with doctors who may not have been fully qualified to perform a hysterectomy, by the time she finally reached the hospital, it was too late and couldn't be saved. That wasn't uncommon in the 60s. So in the end, she not only gave up a child for adoption, but she also lost her own life and, with it, the chance to continue to be a mother to her other 4 children. It's a heartbreaking story, one that reflects not just personal tragedy, but also the shame and stigma that weighed so heavily on women for so many years. And sadly, it's a story that many can still probably relate to in one way or another today.
It took my father time to rearrange his life, to introduce now these 4 children into his new marriage. They had just had a baby. So, that was a real transforming moment. And then we all moved out to my father's house in the country with his new family. And, we were the interlopers. And it was a really tough few years living there, but I did go to a wonderful little country high school and excelled and did very well there. Then I went off to New York City and went to Catherine Gibbs and lived at the Barbizon Hotel for Women. Got a degree there, came back to marry my childhood sweetheart who was in Vietnam, but that didn't work out. I moved to Boston and got a job at Harvard working for the Dr. James Watson microbiology lab.
I'm going to pause here for a moment because this is a really big deal, especially for a young woman in the very early 70s. The James Watson lab she refers to, this was no ordinary workplace. James Watson, already world famous as half of Watson and Crick for discovering the double helix structure of DNA, had joined Harvard's biology department back in the mid-50s. By the late 60s, his laboratory had become a hub for the brand new science of molecular biology. Researchers there were unlocking the secrets of RNA, protein synthesis, and gene regulation, the very foundations of what would grow into modern genetics and biotechnology. So when Melinda stepped into that lab, she was stepping right into the middle of a scientific revolution. The Watson lab at Harvard was buzzing with energy, full of brilliant young scientists and students who were redefining biology itself. At that time, molecular biology was still being invented, and this was one of the places where it was happening. And Melinda, of course, was right in the middle of it.
Worked in the microbiology department. And at that moment, in walked my future husband into my life, and he captured my heart and brought me to Vermont for the summer. So I left Harvard and came with him to Vermont, and we lived in this big farmhouse with about 15 other people. I guess it was as close to a commune that I ever had experienced. And, I wasn't really a hippie at that point, but I did march with Daniel Ellsberg.
In case you're not familiar with Daniel Ellsberg, he was one of the most famous whistleblowers in American history. In 1971, he leaked the Pentagon Papers, exposing how the government had misled Americans about the Vietnam War. So when Melinda says she marched with him, she says I wasn't a hippie yet. But what she was saying is that her free spirit and her authenticity was willing to question authority, challenge injustice, and call for change at a time when that wasn't easy to do.
And then in the fall, because my boyfriend, he decided to go back to school in Denver, so we moved to Denver, and I found out in October that I was pregnant. Well, that was a shock because after my mother died, I stopped eating and I became an anorexic. So I hadn't had my period, and nobody knew what anorexia was back then. I only weighed 90 pounds. And they said I'd never have children. My father took me to all these specialists, and they said, look, she'll never have kids because she can't have a period. But anyway, so when I met my husband, ironically, I did when it was a psilocybin trip, and my period came back. My husband got me pregnant in October. So we started living together in June, and by October I was pregnant. He was shocked because he didn't think I could get pregnant.
This is Melinda's journey. After years of living with an eating disorder and believing she would never have children, a strange twist of fate unfolded during a trip in the 1970s, and her cycle returned with no scientific reason to link the two. But in that moment, it felt as though both her body and spirit were waking up again, and soon they would bring a baby boy into the world to love.
We stuck it out. We moved to Denver. He finished his degree. We had our son in Denver. And then I was really not happy out there because the soil was too hard. So we moved back to Vermont. We moved Christmas Eve. We arrived at his parents' house, unbeknownst to them, in a big tractor trailer with my little Fiat Sports Spider in it, with my 5-month-old baby in our arms. Moved in with his parents. So from there, we eventually found a house to rent in Starksboro. I got a job at the University Health Center when there were only 12 employees. There are now thousands of employees. I got an incredible job working for the director of operations and the finance director. So I had this extraordinary job, and my husband was working working at ETV. He was a filmmaker. So we were raising this little baby. This little trust, tiny little trust, came through from my great-grandmother, who was a florist in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. She didn't give her wealth to her children, and she did not give her wealth to her grandchildren. She gave it to her great-grandchildren. I was one of those. There were 5 of us. At one point, it was a lot of money, but it got contested by everybody. And by the time it came around to me, it was a check for $9,000. So I said to my husband, let's buy car, let's get a piece of land, or let's buy a house, let's do something. We searched around, we couldn't find anything we wanted. It's the weirdest thing with a baby, but we thought maybe we would do some photojournalism and go to the Mideast and settle in Istanbul for a while. And we got our visas. Right at that moment, Suzette Coburn, who was a realtor working for her, she called me. She said, look, I got this piece of land in Huntington. And I went and looked at it. It was all cloudy. And I said, well, it feels really beautiful. And she says, I got to tell you, Melinda, you can't see anything, but it's a beautiful little meadow. And I put a deposit on it right then and there. And I called my husband. I said, I put a deposit on this land. He said, what'd you just do? I said, well, I just felt it. And the next morning he came over and the sun was out in the blue sky, and it was this gorgeous little meadow up on this hillside. We decided to do it in stone. We followed the Scott and Helen Nearing. They wrote the book, Living the Good Life.
Can you imagine spending just $9,000 on a piece of land, building your own home with your own hands, and still living in it 50 years later? I know another couple who did just that. My grandparents. They lived in their home for decades, pillars of our family, and they continue to be my inspiration, even though they've since passed. And I can only imagine that Melinda and her husband are the same for their family. Now, the Nearings, Scott and Helen, were social activists, homesteaders, and authors. In the midst of the Great Depression, they walked away from city life to live simply and self-sufficiently in rural Vermont and later in Maine. In 1954, they published the book that Melinda refers to, Living the Good Life. I'll put links in the show notes. That book became the blueprint for the Back to the Land movement in the 1960s and 70s, inspiring countless people who were searching for a more intentional, sustainable way of living. And in 1974, it became the blueprint for Melinda and her husband. With trials and tribulations along the way, they built their own stone house, piece by piece. That house would become not just the foundation of their lives, but the home where they would raise their family and the enduring foundation of their love.
It was October. We were living in a tent. There was 6 inches of snow, and the roof wasn't on. And I turned to this guy I was living with. We weren't married, but I had his son. I can't do this. So I left him. I went and moved in with a girlfriend, and 3 days later he showed up, and he said, I'll have a roof on by Christmas. Well, we got a roof on by Easter. We moved in. There were no windows. There was plastic on the windows, no phone. There was a pipe coming up from the basement that provided cold water to a masonry tub. It was really rudimentary living, but it was our home. And it was heaven. And we worked on the house every day. Our son wanted a sister. And we said, okay, we'll give you a sister. So I left my job because I couldn't get pregnant. And we started to make this film, Legends of American Skiing. And it was the history of American skiing. So we raised $250,000, which is a lot of money back in 1977. And we made this extraordinary film. The Vermont Humanities Council really made this film happen. And I did get pregnant with Mariah, so I had this little baby. So for 5 years, we were stay-at-home parents, and our son would go off to school, and we raised our little girl, and we were home, the two of us, working on this film. Documentary filmmakers don't make money except when they're making it. Once it's made, you give it away. So I turned to my family and I said, I've got to get a job. And opened up the newspaper, the Free Press, and I saw this ad looking for a person for a development company on the Burlington waterfront. So I applied for this job and I got it. And they were doing a $100 million, 27-acre development on the Burlington waterfront designed by Ben Thompson out of Harvard, sort of like the Boston, Faneuil Hall project or the Baltimore Harbor. It's very similar to those projects. Massive project. So I jumped in. I was 33 years old. So both my kids were in school. Rick was a stay-at-home filmmaker, so he was home with the kids all the time. And I started this powerful job, and we got permitted, fully permitted for this $100 million project. I worked my ass off. I got paid $13,000 a year. The project was a go. We needed infrastructure money. We went for a bond vote. We didn't get 2/3. We got 57%. We got a majority, but we didn't get the 2/3 of the bond vote. It fell through. And the whole thing just imploded. I left there and got a job for Jim Lampman at Champlain Chocolate Company. And I was their marketing director. And I was toting around a chocolate bag full of chocolate around the country, doing private label. And I was really traveling a lot.
Okay, so even if you're not from Vermont, you've probably heard of Lake Champlain chocolates. And if for some reason you haven't, climb out from under that rock, click the link in the show notes, and get yourself some. You won't be disappointed. And no, they're not sponsoring this episode. I just really like their chocolate. Now, here's where Melinda's story takes an interesting turn. She told me that while she was busy toting chocolate around the country, which, by the way, she admits she wasn't all that keen on, something unexpected happened. The woman who was divorcing the man Melinda had been working for on the waterfront project ended up with all of the land in the divorce. This woman, Lisa, called Melinda asking for help, just to button up the sale of the land and take care of payroll. But here's the thing about Melinda. With her fierce determination and her uncanny ability to convince, she didn't just tie up loose ends. Instead, she persuaded Lisa to keep the land. And more than that, she convinced her that together the two of them could do something bigger, develop the Burlington's waterfront in an environmentally sustainable way, which they did.
She became the president. I was the CEO. We were the first people ever to get a shovel in the ground in helping to redevelop the waterfront. And there were 22 attempts in the 20th century. So we were two women. And we did it in a sustainable, green, environmentally and socially responsible way. We have very, very strict policies. We worked with Bill McClay, who's a net zero architect in Waitsfield. We were great visionaries, and we just pulled it together. We did it all green. We got LEED certification of the second building. That was that. And I put in 40 years working for that company, Main Street Landing. And about 3 years ago, I told Lisa that on my 72nd birthday, I was going to leave, that I was done, and I couldn't keep doing this because it was really stressful work, and I wanted to do other things with my life. So May 2nd, on my birthday, I left Main Street Landing without too much hullabaloo and came home. It was the first time that I had been here to watch the changes on this meadow. I mean, for really my entire career. And it was the first time that I really could sit back and kind of look out at the meadow and see all these changes.
You'd think that just because Melinda finally came home, she'd slow down. But Melinda has been working since she was 12 years old. And honestly, I don't think she even understands the word sit. Even with the retirement she set aside, she figured she and her husband would need to keep working well into their 80s to sustain a long life together. At first, Melinda thought about starting a consulting company, but then she paused and asked herself, why am I building something new when I already have a husband who's an amazing filmmaker and could use my help in his business?
There's never been a lot of money in documentary films. And I said, but if you had somebody who could raise money for your projects, we could really be something. Let me get you rebranded. He was not happy. He was like, what are you doing? You're changing everything. I'm like, yeah, I'm changing everything. Within a year, I had raised enough money for him to do 5 projects. I have my TV show, which was called On the Waterfront for many, many years, since the year 2000. And then when I left Main Street Landing, I wasn't on the waterfront anymore. And they said, well, rebrand it, make it your own now. Call it Moments with Melinda. And, I have my grandson, Rowan Riggs. He is a non-speaking autistic 21-year-old. Rick and I made a movie called, it's the Rowan Riggs, Wild Riggs Poetry Retrospective. And we made a 25-minute film of his poetry. It was really well received.
Here's a poem that Rowan wrote. Let's discuss the flowers. They will bestow their glory no matter who is judging you. They will spread and multiply even if you are being destroyed by the cruel. The supple petals will still burst forth even if you stand alone in the dark. The seeds will spread even if the universe is collapsing in on you. When the fires of our lost humanity attempts to envelop you, remember the flowers. I think we should all pause for a moment and remember the flowers the way Rowan sees them, through the eyes of someone who can only speak through his poems. It's a reminder that just because someone cannot speak words out loud does not mean they do not have a voice, and sometimes that voice carries even more truth.
And he's getting nationally known. He was just published in the National Poetry Foundation for Poetry magazine. They paid him for 2 of his poems and did a write-up on him. This is what he wants to do. He communicates in poetry. That's how he talks to the world. So that's a big part of my life, too, is being there for him. And then I have 3 other grandchildren, the girls, and my youngest one is a ski racer. She was 7th in the nation in U16 in giant slalom last year. Then Rowan's sister, she's going to be heading off to college next year. And then Taylor is a golfer and a skier.
I told you at the beginning that Melinda is an influencer in our community, and she truly is. She shared with me about the fire that still burns inside her. And while she may be older now and her fight may look a little different than it did more than 50 years ago, she continues to push for social change wherever she can. Today, Melinda writes for a group called Writing About Our Generation. She's working on her memoir. She dedicates much of her time to fighting for universal health care. And she wants you to hear this message in particular about what the boomers contributed to American history.
But back in the 60s, when we were fighting against the war in Vietnam, we helped push through civil rights, women's rights, disability rights, and planet health, and human rights. I mean, we were the generation that did storm the streets. 3 dead in Ohio. I mean, Neil Young's song. I mean, we gave up our lives, and a lot of my friends went to prison. But at the end of the day, we created tremendous change.
Now, you didn't think I forgot to tell you about the cliff diving story, did you?
I did become a cliff diver. I mean, I would do, 40, 60-foot cliff dives. I once went to an ear doctor, and he said, I have to get my students in here to look at your ears, because the only time I've seen the inside of ears like this is with high divers who dive into cold water. They grow these little growths inside their ears. And he said, I've never seen this. So one day I was up at Red Rock. It was 45-foot dive. And it was low water, low tide that summer. And these little kids came up the path, and I was in my 50s. And they were like, oh, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm going to dive. But you shouldn't do this. And they start chanting, dive, dive, dive. I'm seeing the rocks as I'm going down. And I noticed that there's not a lot of water where I'm going. So the minute I hit the water, thank God I didn't hit the rocks. I did a quick somersault, and I came up. And these boys were looking over the cliff, and they were cheering. So I ran up back the hill, and I said, look, you guys can't go off this cliff. There's no water. Come on, I'm taking you down there. Well, it was about 8 years later. I'm walking down Church Street, and a bunch of guys come running up to me, and they go, you're that lady who dove off the cliff. I am that lady. I am the cliff diver. Well, I haven't cliff dived in a long time, but I was very sick last spring. And my daughter said to my husband, she said, Phoebe and I are going to take Mom to Greece. And my husband said, well, she's not strong enough. And Mariah said, well, I'm taking her, Dad. And within 8 days, I was cliff diving. And I became a cliff diver because of the sorrow of watching my parents split up and realizing that my life would never be the same. And that cliff diving for me was a way to find the freedom to fly.
So that's the story of how an 8-year-old girl sitting in the middle of her parents' divorce decided she was going to be a cliff diver. And in her own way, she's been diving ever since. And honestly, how do you wrap up a life like Melinda's in just a half hour? You can't really. She's done too much, fought too many battles, and still carries that fire inside of her. So instead of trying to tie it all up neatly, I'll end her story the same way I always end mine, by asking, what makes her smile today?
Seeing my husband next to me. We've been together 55 years, waking up in the morning with him, experiencing, coming down here and realizing, the long life that we've had together, and that we still love being with each other, and that we're still so much in love.
You can hear it in her voice, the love she has for Rick after 55 years. It's such a beautiful thing. And naturally, I wanted to ask her for a bit of wisdom. That one message she hopes everyone listening will carry with them. And this is what she had to say.
When you think things are the worst, give yourself 24 hours, because time is the healer, and time waits for no one, and time is the great change maker. Find your quiet spot and give yourself time. Things change. Change is the most constant thing in the universe.
Change is the most constant thing in the world, and I couldn't agree more. That's what this whole podcast is about. And what a fitting note to leave us on as we close out Melinda's episode, and with it, Season 1. I want to thank Melinda for sharing her story so openly with me and with you. She truly is a remarkable woman who is leaving her mark on society, and I am so grateful to have been a part of her journey in this small way. You'll find links to everything we talked about today and more in the show notes. And if Melinda's story or any of the stories from Season 1 have touched your heart or moved you in any way, please take a moment to leave a 5-star review or a comment wherever you listen. It truly helps others, people who need to hear these stories, find the show. To learn more or sign up for our mailing list, head over to changehappenedpodcast.com, where you can also explore more about our guests and what's coming next. Stay tuned for Season 2.
There's always a reason to always choose joy. There's something deeper that the world can't destroy. Smile when you think you can't. Smile, get up and dance. Smile, there's a bigger plan. The storm only lasts for a while. So smile.
Change Happened, Then What? Is written, edited, and produced by me, Heather Holt, at Holt Hill Studios, with the enthusiastic support of my 2 sidekicks, Waylon and Dalton. Until next time, take care of your heart and keep smiling.